It's about more than those breathtaking sunrises. More than the future for those we care about. It's about seeing the whole picture and taking a stand. For over half a century, Club 20 has been the voice of Western Colorado.
Welcome, everybody, to an episode of our Voices of the Western Slope. We are so excited for another episode, and we are joined by some expertise members. So today we will be talking about Proposition 127, which is to prohibit the hunting of bobcat, lynx, and mountain lions. Joining us, we have our Agriculture Committee Co-Chair, Nancy Fishery, and our Public Lands and Natural Resources Committee Co-Chair, Bonnie Brown. We also have our technical experts here with us. Dean Riggs is the former Deputy Regional Manager for CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We have Mr. John Howard, who's the former Chairman of the Parks and Wildlife Commission. And then we have Rick Cables, who's the former Director of CPW. We want to give you guys a full explanation of what exactly this proposition is, what it means for voters, and what it could look like should it pass. For those that are listening, Club 20 did take an official position on this to oppose it. And our main reason is that there is a piece of ballot box biology, which we will get into a little bit later and kind of dive into the issues a little bit more on what that is and who should be managing our habitats and wildlife in our state. So Nancy and Bonnie, before we get started and dive into some of the questions, is there anything that you want to add from each of our committee's perspectives?
I might just add that we're pretty aware of, and Rick, you might help us as we navigate some of this, because U.S. Forest Service manages the habitat and CPW manages the wildlife, but all this gets mixed up when somebody does it on a ballot. And so that's clarifying that may be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Bonnie?
Yeah, and I would just add, Club 20 is very thoughtful in their decision-making process. We track these issues year-round. And I would add that our co-chair for Ag is Ron Velarde, another former CPW Northwest Regional Manager. And so it's unfortunate that he wasn't able to make this podcast today, but he's really helped us form policy on wildlife management issues in Club 20.
Yeah, excellent point, Bonnie and Nancy, both of you. So I'll turn it over to our experts. And if you guys want to give a little bit of your background so we know exactly, who we're talking to, who our audience talks to, that would be great. Let's go ahead and start with Dean. And then we will jump over to the other two of you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the invite. So I worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for the state for 30 years. Prior to coming to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I actually worked with at the Department of Corrections for 3 years and ran the wild horse program and 6 other ag programs that employed inmates. Got an animal science degree from CSU. So my other life was working in the ag industry for 10 years, straight out of college, running cow-calf operations in Colorado. Lifelong hunter and born and raised Colorado.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dean. Let's jump up to John Howard, the former chairman of the Parks and Wildlife Commission.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's always good to be with Club 20. And when I was chair of the commission, Bonnie was probably the most effective advocate for her group. So it's great to be on a call with Bonnie. My background is that I got a law degree back in 1987 from CU when I was an intern there for the National Wildlife Federation for a couple years, working on wildlife issues in Wyoming and Nebraska and Colorado. And stayed during my corporate career, stayed involved in conservation all across North America. And then once we finally got back home to Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper put me on the commission in 2014. And then I did 2 terms as chair of the commission. So these issues are lifelong for me and very dear to me. And I think it's really a pivotal moment for all of us because these ballot initiatives are taking the care of our wildlife away from people like Dean and Rick and giving it to folks that really have a very revolutionary view of wildlife on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. And then last but certainly not least, Mr. Rick Cables, former director of CPW.
Thank you, Brittany. And like John, it's a pleasure to be engaged with Club 20. I worked with Club 20. I was regional forester in the U.S. Forest Service for a decade in Denver, and I had 5 states in my region. And Club 20, I never missed the meetings and would love to come over to the West Slope and engage with the folks in rural Colorado and understand their issues. So I had a 37-year career in the United States Forest Service. The last 10, I was in charge of the Rocky Mountain region, which is 22 million acres, 14 of which are in Colorado. I retired in 2011 and immediately went to work as the director of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And, knew some of the folks like Ron Velarde from my previous life in the Forest Service. But it was a joy. I found the people in Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the staff, are just super professional, dedicated, passionate, and they love their job and they love their mission and they do it well. I retired. I say retired. I'm not very good at retirement. I left CPW in 2013, and then went to work as a high up in the Vail Resort structure, bringing into Vail, the ski company, knowledge of natural resources and environmental sustainability programs, and did that for almost 5 years, and then tried to retire again and ended up creating my own little LLC as a consultant. And I do a lot of work with the ski industry, but other clients as well as a consultant. So I've spent 45 years in natural resource management. I am a lifelong hunter as well. And I love Colorado. And this issue is near and dear to me because, as John says, I think the ballot box initiatives are a very significant threat to scientific management of wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rick, I must say, and to the rest of you as well, our membership is very good at retiring and then staying very involved or finding other activities to be a part of. So it seems to be a common thread for the folks that are over here on the Western Slope or have worked over here. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. So I apologize. It looks like you're going to have to continue keeping that up. With that, who wants to take a stab at explaining what exactly this proposition is and what it means for Colorado voters should it get passed?
I can take an initial shot at this. From my perspective, this is an anti-hunting ballot box initiative. And I'm going to say from the very start, remember the 4 B's. Ballot box biology is bad. It's bad because it ignores science. It does not consider science in the holistic way that an agency like CPW would, or a commission appointed by governor, the governor's a bipartisan commission with representatives from every quadrant geographically of the state and different interest groups like ag, recreation, sportsmen. The concept is you've got a commission that oversees policy with respect to wildlife, and the commission represents citizens, like I said, from different geographies and disciplines. And then you've got a professional agency, and frankly, Colorado Parks and Wildlife is one of the top 2 or 3 wildlife agencies in the United States. It's got the largest research staff of any wildlife agency in the United States. And the people in the agency have dedicated their lives to taking care of wildlife. And honestly, there is no threat to lions or bobcats in Colorado. In fact, the agency has done such a superb job managing wildlife, including the big cats, that their numbers or populations are thriving. So this ballot box initiative, in my mind, is a solution in search of a problem. There is no problem with the wildlife, with these species, with these big cat species in Colorado. So the Proposition 127 is basically, the shorthand is to eliminate hunting of the big cats, period. That you'll hear the words trophy hunting and all this other subterfuge, but really it's about ending hunting of the big cats. And it ignores the prey base, because in a predator-prey system, which is what all these systems are, where you've got a prey base and deer, in this case deer and bighorn sheep and elk and other species that these cats prey on, and then you have the predators themselves. And you have to look at them together. You can't look at them separately. You can't ignore one over the other. So eliminating hunting of the predator without recognizing what that's going to do to the prey and the prey base is not scientific. It's not rational even, at least, as everything I've been taught. And I think Dean will certainly, speak to being, working as a biologist and working in the agency. So fundamentally, this proposition eliminates hunting of big cats, and that's all it does. But then the consequences of that on the other wildlife species are not considered.
Right. And I think that's an important piece. You keep bringing back, it's not the scientific approach. And so we try to take in, like Bonnie mentioned earlier, both sides of the conversation before we form our judgments. And we do hear from a lot of those experts that are taking science into consideration, which they should, in our opinion, on an issue like this. Who are the larger groups that are for this, and who are against this currently? Are you guys aware of any big campaigns? I know that there's quite a few out there, but is there somebody that wants to take this piece under wraps?
Well, I can take it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, that it's the usual suspects in regard to animal welfare issues, if you want to call them that, right? It's the Humane Societies of the United States. It's Sierra Club, it's Audubon, it's all of those folks that are pushing these issues as usual, that are obviously trying to get away from hunting cats in this case. Rick's comments are exactly right. I mean, no matter what they say on their advertisements, this isn't about hunting. No, it's about hunting. It's absolutely about hunting. And the scary part about it is if we vote on this and we pass this, well, where does that stop, right? And the fact is that it doesn't stop until you stop hunting. And I've been telling people in my orbit that this stops at the end of the line, right? Eventually, these same folks will get to things that matter to you, right? Even if you're just a fisherman, they'll get eventually to the scaly things as well. But it's really easy for them to look at the furry things and fight on that side. So then you've got the other side of it, which is obviously the sportsmen of the state of Colorado, who are very concerned about this for those reasons that I just mentioned. And you've got the rest of the people in the state of Colorado, the livestock folks, that are certainly have a concern here and should, because it does impact those folks and the landowners. One of the real, I think, disheartening things is those people that I just mentioned, livestock people, hunters and anglers and landowners in the state of Colorado, and even our federal partners at BLM and Forest Service have worked really, 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 really hard over the last 125 years, I'll call it, to try to come to an equilibrium on things like predators. And that's not it's not been easy. It's been full of disagreements along the way. But we find ourselves in a place today where a lot of that hard work has paid off, and a lot of people are pretty happy with how this thing is going overall. Rick's comments about the numbers of those cats in the state of Colorado are correct, but I would even put it into the bigger perspective of what's it look like nationally. Well, guess what? Mountain lions are showing up in places they haven't been for decades. And so when I look at places like Texas, well, where are the mountain lions coming from to repopulate Texas? Undoubtedly, some of those mountain lions are coming out of Colorado and New Mexico, right? There's the bigger picture, and I'm sure through this thing we'll get into some more of the unintended consequences, because I think there's some stuff there that we haven't even begun to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points there, Dean. We've definitely touched a little bit on who this will directly impact. It feels very suspicious, so to say, that, it just feels like another attack to our rural communities right now, to our agriculture community, to our sportsmen that like to come and play over here. And you mentioned the overall picture too. It's not just in Colorado. We have to talk about the biology pieces. We have to talk about where they're coming in and leaving and moving, migrating to, which brings us to that biological piece. We have to take all those considerations, definitely. Can we kind of give an overview of what exactly ballot box biology is in our state, but just in general, what is ballot box biology and where have we seen this before? It's a big one, so whoever's the bravest.
Well, we saw it in 1996 when we lost spring bear hunting and the traditional methods of hunting for bear, which are baiting and hounds. I bear hunt every year. It's very ineffective, and that's part of the reason why we have such a large bear population, because you just have to stumble into them. And the traditional methods that have been used by humans for the last 7,000 years, in which our tribes in Colorado still use, they're closed off. And so you see an explosion of the bear population with its impact across the state. Ag producers, when you have a bad year in the Roaring Fork, those bears all come down into Carbondale and in Aspen and Glenwood. And unfortunately, the wildlife professionals at CPW are the ones that end up having to euthanize those bears. And I'm sure, Dean can talk to that. That's not why you go to college and get a wildlife biology degree to euthanize a bear, because of bad human policy. Then I think we lost the right to trap with the only effective means for trapping on a lot of these predators, and I think that was 1998. And so again, you all of a sudden you start to see an increase in things like coyotes and other types of animals that are again going to have an impact on ag producers and also on our urban populations. We lived on the Front Range for a time, and the coyote problem there in suburban Boulder and in Denver, is really quite extreme at times, especially on pets and children. So these tools are best left in the hands of folks like Rick and Dean. They're not out to be cruel. They're out to manage the population. I think one of the things the advocates never deal with is, and I saw this when I was on the stakeholder advisory group for the wolf introduction, they really have a vision that's very different. It's almost like you're in Disneyland. If we just leave everything alone, it'll all come into a natural balance. And what they don't ever deal with is the fact that, a couple hundred years ago, there were maybe 100,000 people on the landscape. Now we've got 6 million people. So our wildlife managers like Rick and Dean are dealing with how to keep these populations healthy and active, as a part of our ecology, but still have 6 million people on the landscape. And so, it's tough when you're in the room with these folks because they really aren't science-based, they're emotion-based. And I'll just echo what Dean said earlier, that wolf introduction was a moment for the activists when they were really confident that they had the public mood. And so I sat in the room for those stakeholder advisory groups and heard them openly say that they wanted to get rid of hunting, that this was the first step in getting rid of traditional hunting, and talking about how immoral it was. And they've now taken that back. You don't see that come out in the campaign on lions because they know that that's not popular. But I don't have any doubt, having sat in the room for 18 months, that that's their ultimate goal. And even to the point of fishing, I know it's hard to believe, but one of the commissioners that's now on the CPW commission is openly advocated to stop CPW from stocking with rainbows and other types of sport fish, and going back to streams that only have essentially endangered and threatened species. So the end product of that is no hatcheries and no sport fishing in Colorado. I mean, can you imagine the economic impact, particularly on the West Slope and in the rest of rural Colorado? So this is a critical time. The points that my fellow guests are making are right. This is an attempt to completely remake the landscape for wildlife in Colorado. And I'll close with this, is what we have now is kind of a virtuous cycle. People lion hunt, they pay for the tags, that creates revenue, that goes back to CPW to fund science and management. And we know what this will look like if that's taken away, because we can look at California. It's not that they're killing less lions. It's just that they're not doing it with lion hunting. People like Dean and Rick have to go out and kill them, and then they put them in a landfill or leave them to rot on the landscape, and there's no revenue coming back to California Fish and Game. So, this is really a dramatic moment, and we need to win. This Proposition 127 needs to go down, because there'll be another one in the next cycle.
Yeah, and we've heard that quite a few times now, that what's next, that we're always saying that over here on the Western Slope. If this goes through, what's next? What kind of a precedent does this set? Does this set us towards a downward spiral trajectory that's only going to continue to build and build? And the connection piece there, I think, that you mentioned too, John, is really important. It won't just impact hunting. It won't just impact the public lands resources committees. All of our committees that we touch on, you can't talk about water without talking about public lands. You can't talk about ag without talking about public lands. They all have an intersection, and that tourism piece that you hit on, the economical side, to allow our agency staff to do the work that they are supposed to do and manage, is a really scary thought that could be taken away. And people don't realize all of these unintended consequences that we're just slightly diving into a little bit here. But I want to make sure that Bonnie gets a chance to voice what she had to say. And then also, Rick, I see you have some words of wisdom as well for us. So Bonnie, feel free to chime in.
Thanks. This ballot initiative, the language in it is so disingenuous, and it should be a red flag to voters when ballot language is so inflammatory and emotional. I mean, that should be your first red flag to step back and do your due diligence and try to do some objective analysis. But, one example, I mean, this is references trophy hunting. It appears to give an exemption for protecting livestock, but then in the next sentence, it basically takes that away because there's a little caveat, and appropriate non-lethal methods have to be used. Well, a lot of times when you're protecting livestock, you need to take care of the imminent threat out there. We annually lose tens of thousands of animals here in Colorado to livestock depredation, and including mountain lions, and we're seeing that with wolves now. I also want to, point out to people that maybe aren't wrapped around the axle on this issue. Hunting bears and lions, hunting these large carnivores and putting pressure on them is a deterrent for them to learn to stay away from people. And we've seen the changes since we lost spring bear hunting. I grew up here in Colorado. I was born in Grand Junction. Childhood spent on the Mesa. You'd never see a bear up there. And it's not unusual when I'm out and about up in the mountains to either see a mountain lion or a bear. And honestly, I don't even have to go that far, even though I'm in Delta out in the Adobes. We've had bears coming off the mesa. I believe I'm still correct in saying that the Grand Mesa has the largest black bear population in the state. I know just up the road at Eckert a few weeks ago, there was a mountain lion coming down those draws by Eckert. So we don't have a problem, as earlier pointed out, with the population. Here in Colorado, we do have a problem with the number of people recreating on our national forests and not having that pressure on predators where they understand to stay away from people. And it doesn't even need to be recreating. You just look at our mountain towns with the number of conflicts. In Lake City, just last week, that bear came down and 4 bears ended up in a gentleman's house. And fortunately, he survived that attack. But we need to manage these predators.
Yeah, and Bonnie, before I hand it over to Rick here, I think it's important to note that these animals are very smart creatures. They're very smart creatures, but they don't know where county lines are. They don't know where the state lines are. They're going to go where they can find food and where they can find habitats that will support them. So we can't control where they're going to explore. We can watch their patterns and we can see, we could predict potentially where they're going to be, but they have a mind of their own and they're not going to be able to be stopped by a county line or by a state line. So I think that's an important piece there that you had mentioned, Bonnie. Rick?
Yeah, great points. I want to go back a little bit to what John said too. It's like, it's easy to think, without diving deep into the science and the consequences. It's easy to think, well, if I vote for this ballot, I'll save the lions. I'm gonna save the lions, or back to the wolf reintroduction. And John pointed out there's 6 million people in this state now, and it's growing. I'm concerned about the lions and the wolves in this. I don't want them to be hurt. And when you put wolves on the landscape in a state with this kind of a population and a growing population, and 10 million in the next, couple decades, the wolves are the ones that are going to be hurt. They're not going to play the natural role that they could play in a state. When we put wolves on the landscape in the Yellowstone ecosystem, we have 20 million acres to play with Yellowstone in the center of it, and a bunch of national forests all surrounding it. And that system was large enough to actually let wolves play and have a natural prey-predator relationship in an ecosystem that was large enough to allow it to function in a way that it was intended to function in nature. And the other thing is, I don't believe this should be a rural-urban thing, even though it is at the ballot box in all sorts of ways, not just with wildlife, because the majority of the population in this nation are in urban areas. We know that. But it shouldn't be, it's not urban versus rural. This is really a discussion about science versus non-science. Wildlife management is complex, and the biology and the habitat requirements and the population requirements is complex, and it requires science, study, choices, consequences of those choices. And that's what honestly is why wildlife has recovered so significantly in the United States from when it was almost wiped out, when the white man first started moving across the nation, and, we had overhunting and all the rest of it. And that's what led to state wildlife agencies. And we've rebuilt. Dean said there's lions in places we've never seen them. Bonnie just said that we've got a bear population that's crazy, and it is. It's 20,000 bears or somewhere in that neighborhood in this state. Wild turkeys are prolific. We've got moose taking over, drainages where we never had moose. And to balance these things, you need tools. Biologists and scientists need tools, and hunting is one of the tools. It is. And And I know that there's a lot of people legitimately are anti-hunting. I respect that. You can be anti-hunting. I understand that and the philosophy underneath that. I'm just saying that the tool to help manage these populations is critical and it's necessary, or we're going to have consequences we don't want, like our wildlife professionals going out and having to shoot bears and lions, or wildlife services having to do it. That's not the picture we want. That's not the right way, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, you touched on a good point there. We talked about the tools, but I think we also need the time for those ecosystems to redevelop and to build back what was lost before. It feels like it's just continuously one thing after another, and we're always playing this catch-up game rather than watching something all the way through, seeing it through, and finding best practices of management in those places before we start messing with that ecosystem again while it's still unstable. I think that's a really important piece there. Timing, I think, is everything in wildlife management from my perspective. But Dean, I know you have a big background with your degree. If you want to kind of talk through some of those sciences behind what that looks like.
Sure. So I was just sitting here thinking as Rick was talking, one of the unintended consequences that comes to my mind is on lions and bobcats right now, they have to go through a mandatory check process, right? Now that part of that's put CITES tags on them, but that's where we get the scientific information to then infer what the population looks like, right? So if you quit hunting those animals today, where's that information going to come from? With species like deer, like elk, right? We do classification counts every year on those species, and we gather that information, and then we feed that into computer models that helps us model that population and come up with an estimate of numbers, composition, and those kind of things. You don't have that on mountain lions and bobcats. Nothing like that exists outside of taking this information that you get off of hunter harvested animals. So that's not even being discussed in this thing at all. We absolutely lose the ability then to even estimate what the population is in the state of Colorado. Well, so on the one side of that, is the population expanding or is the population contracting? And the problem with that, as a wildlife manager, I can tell you from past experience is, man, if you're not on top of that when it starts to contract, then you very well could go down the endangered species road with that particular population. So that's the science-based side of this stuff. In Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the professionals there, the guys with the bachelor's and the master's and even the PhD degrees in wildlife biology are the guys that are helping us understand these populations out there. There's a real misnomer here in that the folks that are pushing this are trying to say, wait, those aren't the scientists, we're the scientists, right? So there's a debunking of science going on here as well, especially science produced by what I consider to be the professionals, which is the people at Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and a few researchers on the other side. And then there's this thought process that somehow management is a bad word of species. The fact is, for me, there is that, well, you can do a research project, and certainly research projects are important to the science of wildlife management. I would never say that that's not important. It absolutely is. But then you've got to be able to take that science that's out of a research project and apply it to the ground out there. And that's what your local district wildlife manager does for you, right? And your local biologist, they then take that science and apply it to the ground out there. Without doing that science is, I wouldn't say it's worthless, but it's not as effective. And there's the disconnect, right? There's the disconnect with these folks that they think that you can just leave it alone, as Rick said, and everything will be fine. Well, maybe back in the 1800s, but not in Colorado today. That's just not realistic at all from a scientific perspective. So that was one of the unintended consequences from a scientific perspective that I think we got at there, and hopefully I kind of hit the science side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head for sure. We've talked quite a bit about, added pressures to the agency staff and what their role should look like. I kind of want to talk about what it would look like should this go through. What added pressures does it add to our staff? How are they going to be able to manage that? It feels like we're always having issues, especially right now. We're hearing that our agency staff is just so overwhelmed right now. They're trying to get a hold of things, and they don't necessarily have the tools and the resources that they need to do their jobs effectively. And from what I've heard, is there's some frustration there because they, like you said, they put in the time and they've learned all of these things, and they're being not necessarily told what to do, but they don't have the full scope of practice for them to be able to utilize all of the necessary tools in the toolbox. So what could this potentially mean for our Parks and Wildlife Services here in Colorado and wildlife in general? What does that look like for our agency staff?
I'll take a shot at that. When you deny the wildlife professionals the ability to address issues with wildlife, and that's what ballot box biology does. It bypasses the wildlife professionals. Okay. The wildlife professionals are able to make adjustments, as Dean said, for things like climate change, habitat changes, moisture changes, changes in the prey base. They can adjust populations through using hunting as a tool to keep the populations in balance. And so you deny the professionals the ability to do that when you take one part of this complex system, in this case, let's just say lions, and you say they will never be managed again with hunting. Okay, so that population can grow exponentially like bears have in Colorado. And then as I think John said, so then the district wildlife managers, instead of managing wildlife and contacting hunters and talking to people and learning and talking to ag producers and others and looking at habitat work, they're off chasing problem bears and lions that are eating people's dogs. And getting into the bird feeders in the Roaring Fork Valley or down by Levita or wherever you pick a place. That's what you're doing. You're earmarking the biologists and the field people's time to do other kinds of work with wildlife conflict with these predators that are unmanaged now, could be. We hope not. We hope Proposition 127 doesn't pass. But if it did, you would replicate what happened with the bear population. And so then there's a demoralizing effect, I think, on the wildlife professionals too. It's almost like, why are we even doing this? We signed on to do this because we believed in the mission in protecting wildlife and managing wildlife and understand the complexities and the balance in the system. And then, there's a ballot initiative and voters in the urban areas just vote to take away hunting or one of the tools we use. So, at some point, the biologists themselves or the wildlife professionals can become demoralized, and it's almost like, well, what's the value in what we even do if someone can introduce a ballot initiative and it's, majority rules in terms of votes without considering the science and the research that they've done and studied. I mean, and then there's other factor, I think at least, and the state mammal's the bighorn sheep. Do you know bighorn sheep are like ice cream to lions? They love to eat bighorn sheep. And if we have an unmitigated population growth of lions in Colorado, I predict the sheep population is going to be significantly reduced. And no one's thinking about that when they're at the ballot box right now, because there's no disclosure of the potential effect. Certainly the deer population. I mean, a full-grown lion eats a deer once every 5 to 7 days. One lion eats one deer once a week. And that's, if you have a lot of lions, you're going to have a lot of deer mortality and elk and other things. So, and again, the professionals in these agencies, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, they want to be able to ensure that the system is in balance and working as designed. And arbitrarily taking one component and saying, okay, this population will never be managed again because we're going to vote on it, it's very troubling to the wildlife professionals. It honestly is.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a disconnect of the information that's coming through of what exactly the impacts will be versus the front. Let's keep the fluffy animals around. We don't think about the other side of things, where there's people that are just kind of thinking on the front end and not looking at those unintended consequences, which we've kind of been talking about quite a bit. But I wanted to check in to see if there were some other comments on unintended consequences down the line, potentially with the attraction of, getting those degrees and studying that wildlife management. What does that mean for Colorado? I know that we have great programs here in Colorado. Could that deter people from continuing on in this field and potentially becoming a dying profession here, Bonnie?
I don't want to jump in front of John Howard. I want John to make some comments first, and then I'll follow up after John.
John?
Oh, well, I think that's the case. I've been sitting here thinking about a podcast I just listened to on the Meat Eater podcast, which is extremely popular amongst conservationists. And I just saw one yesterday in which they were talking about a lion study in Washington. And Washington has outlawed hunting of lions with hounds. And so the study that was being worked on and being reported on was the fact that the lions are now coming into agriculture and even into urban areas because they've lost their fear of man. And what the study was doing was using hounds not to hunt them, because that's illegal, but to try and haze them, to generate a fear, again, of man so that they would draw back into the wilderness and stay out of ag lands and urban settings. And to your point, or your question about could this have an impact on the profession, it certainly has had an impact on houndsmen and houndswomen in Washington, because there aren't hardly any of them. And the research scientists had a harder time for their study to get houndsmen to come and help them. In this hazing process. And so that's one of these unintended consequences, I think, that we're kind of talking about, these lions need to fear humans. That actually is the natural state, right? If we look back thousands of years, humans and these large predators had a relationship, and it was one of mutual fear. And when you take away human ability to engender that in the species, well, they're going to expand. And it's not because they're bad or evil, or we're talking about Little Red Riding Hood. It's what we're talking about is you need to keep pressure on these animals so that they will stay away from the areas where humans are, or where folks like Bonnie are raising sheep. So let me just touch on one other thing that I have this somewhat unique perspective, having been, pulled into the wolf reintroduction, is really what's going on here too, and I think is something you would see, is it's political interference in what should be a scientific management process. We received, when I was on the stakeholder committee for wolves, overwhelming advice from Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Wyoming, that we needed to complete the introduction plan. And it was incredibly important that we talk with ag producers and develop a definition of depredating animals, and that we have a full conversation about a hunting season on wolves once they had been restored. And I don't know how many times I put that on the agenda, and it was removed by the governor's office and his political appointees in DNR. And now we see what's happening, right? We have wolves on the ground. We have no way to manage depredating wolves because the commission was never really able to deal with that. And to your point about wolves, normally you don't really have a big problem with wolves attacking humans, but we've got this experiment going in Colorado where there's 6 million people on the landscape, and there's no plan to put pressure on them. So goodness knows what it's gonna be like in 10 years. We have a full wolf population and no way to manage them. And so that's what'll happen with lions. And we know that from Washington and California, because you've got lions in the middle of downtown Los Angeles now. And to a point I think Rick made earlier, who suffers from that? It's the lions. There was a lion, it was living in Griffith Park in downtown Los Angeles, and it finally died, I think, last year. They discovered when they did the study on that lion after it had died, I never can pronounce this right, necrosby, I think is the right way, but they discovered it had been hit by a car at least 3 times, that it had incredible amounts of lead and other poisons in it. That's what goes on when these animals don't have pressure on them to stay away from humans, because that's what kills predators, is human beings. And so giving people like Dean and Rick the ability to manage these animals with hunting and other tools is critical, unless we want to end up in these really strange situations like you see in Washington and California.
Yeah, excellent.
So, John,
Bonnie. Yeah.
John, thanks for setting me up so well for the points that I wanted to make. You know, we are just loving our federal lands to death. We are, and our state lands, with this incredible, almost exponential growth we're seeing here in Colorado. Privately owned habitat really is the last great refuge for wildlife in Colorado, as we're seeing wildlife trying to escape pressure from recreation. You know, they're getting into the mountain towns that we've built into. But these big farm and ranch land holdings are really excellent habitat. And so they're certainly a winter haven for our deer and elk herds. And with that comes the prey species that come along with that. If this ballot initiative passes, livestock owners won't be compensated for losses to lions anymore. And we really need to make sure that we continue to work with our landowners, because they are providing a lot of critical habitat for our state's wildlife. And we talked a lot about wolves today. And, you know, one of the things I want to point out on the wolf introduction, and this is why it's so important for voters to do their due diligence on this, because on the wolf introduction, the Blue Book summaries were wholly inadequate on this issue. And if you look at the wolf initiative and that process we went through in 2020, really the standard bearer for the wolf argument was that Colorado has a lot of federal lands, and wolves would be roaming freely around on our federal lands. So why shouldn't we have wolves? Well, wolves weren't released on federal lands. They were released on state lands very near to private land. And all the wolf depredation that we've seen has been on private property, except there's been a little on state lands that was privately leased. And so to date, unless something's happened maybe in the last couple of weeks that hasn't been confirmed yet, there's been no wolf depredations with wolves killing livestock on federal lands. That's occurring on private property. So I just want to finish up with Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a really good document. It's a frequently asked questions document on bobcats, mountain lions, and lynx that is very objective. It talks about mountain lion population and how things are managed. So I'd really encourage people to take a look at that document before they vote.
Yeah, I think, Bonnie, you make a good point. You know, we want to make sure that voters are using this podcast and other things as educational resources for them to kind of just start these conversations, start diving into these issues so that they can really see the truth behind it all. And I think what we want to do here is not to necessarily tell you to vote one way or another, but we want to give you the tools to dive in and let you know why we feel like this could be very detrimental to our state and our wildlife habitats here. I want to turn it over to Nancy a little bit and ask her, because as the former PLNR chair, she did a lot of work trying to bridge the gap between our folks here in the community and also the agencies. I want to talk through what some of those challenges were with you, Nancy, because I think stakeholder impact and communication lines between our citizens here in Colorado and the agency staff at the state level is really important moving forward to manage our wildlife here. Could you speak to those challenges a little bit, and what went well and how we could maybe continue to build the bridge, like you've mentioned, through our policy committees over the years?
I can't thank our panelists enough, because almost every issue we came up with in our committees, you've addressed admirably. It's the unintended consequences, which aren't sexy to talk about. You don't read it in our Colorado mainstream media. It's the fact that it's very difficult for people on the Western Slope to relate to people on the intensive part of the population of the Front Range. We've been just we just know it's a big problem and have not all been able to penetrate that. But the politics that have become involved I haven't worked at it as long as you guys have, but the amount of politics today when we come up with these issues, it's just amazing. We constantly, as Club 20 committees, trying to bring people like you to other groups to understand the kind of science you guys bring. And when you guys come in a room, you turn people's minds overnight. They know all of a sudden what we're saying when we talk about science. I've done it. I worked for the timber industry for years, so I was on the periphery of the wildlife management issues. But it's very hard. To be fair, if I lived in an urban area, I wouldn't even understand some of the things you mentioned, John and Rick and Dean, because it doesn't, when we talk about 6 million people and, bears or the lions, it doesn't connect for them. We live in a very rural area here in the Uncompahgre Valley, and I can tell you within a mile of our farm, we see mountain lions. Maybe they're bobcats. People just can't imagine where these animals go. And you can say as much as you want, Rick, that this isn't Yellowstone. I don't think they get that. They think they're doing well in Wyoming and Idaho. And yet John, you spoke of all those technical committee meetings on wolves. Experts from other states didn't think it was a good idea to introduce wolves here, because it isn't Idaho, Montana. It's a very small land area. Would you say, Rick, there's like 14 million acres of the kind of habitat that we're talking about? And so much of it's on U.S. Forest Service. There's a very important piece, which is how much the private landowners are providing private grazing grounds. I have a herd of deer that go across my farm every day. People, if you lived in downtown Denver, you don't get it. If you lived on the outskirts, you did understand some of the problems with the coyotes of the Netherlands. They certainly understood the problems with the mountain lions. But most of the people in downtown Denver, Boulder, they don't get it. So for you to give your time, retirees, appreciate it. I'm retired too. We can't give up, although every once in a while you just feel like giving up. And it makes me wonder about our staff. And Club 20 has always been most concerned about the staff and what they must think, because they're not giving the answers. The politicians are giving the answers, which makes it twice as frustrating if that is your job and your passion. So you all brought all those issues out very well, very articulate men. I appreciate it. Thank you, Brittany, for pulling it together. And Bonnie asked for this podcast. And that's what we try to do, just find one more avenue to talk to a few more people so they understand what our reality is in the rural areas. So I want to thank you all. I haven't had any silver bullets how to talk to the Front Range. I really don't. It's something we care about and we worry about, so we work on it. But podcasts are maybe one tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to voice a thank you to all of you guys as well. And Nancy did a great job of thanking you, but, it's very instrumental that we have these conversations and that we continue to talk about these things so that people can start to dive into it and ask questions. So before I fully wrap us up, I want to see if there's any closing comments from the three of you, or, just one of you, whatever it looks like. We welcome your closing comments, and then I will close us all out of here. And I appreciate your time today.
Let me just say for myself, we love wildlife. We're not advocating voting no on Proposition 127 because we want to hurt lions. We want lions to play their natural role in the system that we have on the landscape, not dreaming that it's the 1800s. So I know John and Dean love wildlife. They care about it. They've dedicated much of their life to study it. I have, to work towards preservation or conservation. And honestly, the system that we have in the United States, where state wildlife agencies with commissions providing oversight manage wildlife populations in the states, has created the most robust populations of wildlife anywhere in the world. And it's called the North American model of wildlife conservation. And it basically means sportsmen buy hunting license and fishing licenses, and the revenue from those licenses pays the salary of the agency personnel managing, the wildlife for all of us. It's an elegant system. It's beautiful, and it's worked extremely well. There's no problem in Colorado right now with the population of lions and bobcats. They're thriving. They're doing great. So I just, I think it's easy for people that have these signs up, vote no on proposition or vote yes on Proposition 127, to believe that if you didn't agree with it, that they think that you don't like lions. You just want to see lions killed. It's not the truth. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to join in with you guys, and hopefully it was valuable. That's it. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. John or Dean?
It's one of the things that I think is hard that Nancy brought up is, how do you talk to the Front Range about this? And I lived over there for a while. I went to school over there. And so I do talk to folks over there. And one of the things I tell them is, the greatest privilege for me, and there were a lot, of being chairman of the commission, was that I actually got to meet with the chairs of both of our tribes, the Ute Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes. Southern Utes have a very sophisticated natural resource agency within the tribe. And one of the things that I find so tough about Proposition 127 that really angers me is when they use this term trophy hunting. Both of our tribes, use hounds to chase lions. They harvest that meat, and then they use the hides and other parts of the animal in cultural and religious ceremonies. Are they trophy hunters? Or are they the first real conservationists teaching us that you should make use of the entire animal if you harvest it, and to see them and to talk to them about the significance of when they harvest an animal and the ceremonies and the respect they give? It's really quite something then to bring that to the Front Range and talk to them about it, because what's being advocated by the activists that are pushing 127 is that these animals be shot by people like Dean and Rick and DWMs, and then put in a landfill or left to rot. Now, is that really moral? I would say to you, we should really learn from our tribes, and we should really understand that, and when we talk to the Front Range, that the moral side of this, the right side of this, is our side. It's not these activists that don't know anything about science and frankly don't seem to be very interested in learning anything about science.
Yeah, John, I think that's a very important piece of everything. Using the entire animal for certain things is such a tradition, and that is fully utilized by specifically our tribes, but others that are here as well. So the term trophy hunting in this scenario, that's where you get into that moral gray ground from their perspectives. So I think that's a really important piece to dive into. So thank you for that perspective, Dean.
Nancy, I would go back on your thought process of the Front Range folks, and because I've now spent a lifetime and then some, it seems like, just trying to educate people on wildlife, right? From from a group of 8-year-olds in Pueblo County schools to on up through every contact that you have as a wildlife officer, and every contact you have is an opportunity to educate somebody about wildlife and what's truth and what's fiction in wildlife. Now, that's a challenge in our society today. There's a whole lot of fiction out there on all sorts of things, but I continue to hold to the thought process that if you educate people, then if we go out and we vote on something, then at least we're going out there, no matter your stance, at least we're going out there with our magazine full of bullets, and not completely just take it winging at it because it's on the ballot. And I looked at the Blue Book the other day. There's 13 things on the ballot that we're going to be voting for outside of people, right, in different places. So, for instance, I had to dig my dogs in for shots the other day, so I'm talking to my vet about the one on vet stuff. Well, it's a good thing I talked to him, right, because I got more educated on that issue. And I'm a full supporter in our process in the United States of America on the people having the say, but you got to be educated. Don't just go in there and pull down the lever on something because you've heard one side of the story. This is a perfect example of that. You need to be educated, and that's really what's wrong with it. And I think we've gotten to that today throughout this whole thing about, well, then why don't we have 900 people or whatever the number is in the agency now employed in the first place if we're not going to pay attention to what they know and think about wildlife, because they're the experts in this particular field. So, and I'll echo Bonnie there too, is that, man, without the support of the private landowners and the livestock owners in the state of Colorado and a tolerance for wildlife, then this whole thing falls flat on its face. And this is yet another place where, boy, if we don't continue to have that support, we won't have the wildlife populations that we have in the future in the state of Colorado. We need those private landowners on the side of wildlife. And this thing, I hope, goes the right direction. I don't think there's any assurance of that in the next couple of weeks before we vote, but hopefully educational processes like these help as well.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you, Rick, John, Dean, Nancy, and Bonnie for all of the great comments today. Again, to our listeners, I'm Brittany Dixon, your host of the Voices of the Western Slope podcast, and we just encourage you to get out there, educate yourself on this issue. It's in your blue books, but far beyond your blue books, reach out to your wildlife professionals that are in your regions. Please get educated on this issue to truly understand. Even if you walk away still with the same mindset, just get educated so that you know how to either better form your own arguments, but to have those conversations. I think a lot of the time we miss that, and civil discourse is far and few between these days. So that's one thing here at Club 20 that we try to encourage. We are a nonpartisan organization, and it's because of reasons like this. We want to make sure that we are providing the education and the tools for our listeners and for our members to get educated on issues. We encourage you to show up to vote on all matters, and not just this one. But please feel free to reach out to us at any time. You can find our information online at www.club20.org. And with that, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.
Because our way of life is worth protecting. Join Club 20 today. Visit club20.org to learn how.